In the last lecture, we talked about some of the traditional beliefs and philosophical assumptions of the Yoruba people. But one might ask, is this really philosophy? I mean, after all, isn't philosophy an analysis of these things, questioning some beliefs or trying to make them consistent? One of the fascinating things about contemporary African thought is that that, in fact, is one of the main debates. In fact, the question is often put, is there a traditional African philosophy, or is there African philosophy at all? That may seem like an odd question for a tradition to be asking. To put this in perspective, it's necessary to consider the fact that in sub-Saharan Africa, most of these nations were, or in fact all of these nations were at one point colonized. And one of the results of colonization was a lot of destruction of records that had something to do with philosophical thought. Colonization sometimes did this very intentionally. The Mexican Inquisitor, for example, after the Spanish came into Mexico, decided that what should be done is as many of the picture books of the Aztecs as possible should be destroyed. And in fact, we ended up losing to humanity much information about the Aztecs and their thought. Or similarly, in the American Allotment Act of 1887, there was a deliberate effort to ban the practice of American Indian religions on the reservation. And this stayed on the books until 1934, quite a long time for a couple of generations not to be trained in the traditional beliefs of their societies. And so what one has in these situations is a case where it's not clear how much what comes down to us is actually what thought was like at a previous time before colonialism. And one big question that gets raised as a result of that is, what have we inherited? Particularly in Latin America and Africa, philosophers ask, are any of the ideas we have really very true to our tradition? What do we do with the fact that a lot of our understanding of philosophy does come to us from the West? After all, our own cultural identity doesn't seem to have much to do with the philosophical problems that are discussed at all. Now, the question that comes up, a kind of philosophical question, is really, what is philosophy after all? And there are two, I would say, somewhat extreme answers to this question. One of them is the answer given by universalists. Universalists claim that philosophy is basically the same project wherever it's practiced. In philosophy, what we try to do is systematize beliefs, offer criticism to those beliefs, try to figure out whether or not these beliefs really are solid or helpful, and whether they pass various tests of reason. The alternative is culturalism, which contends that philosophy, like any other human endeavor, depends in many ways on the circumstances in which it occurs. What become philosophical issues have much to do with the society in which these issues are discussed. And in fact, many culturalists would say, you don't have to have written philosophy, texts of the sort that we're accustomed to in the West, in order to have philosophy at all. In fact, many of the practices of a society themselves implicitly indicate philosophical beliefs. One of the further reasons for philosophers in Latin America and Africa to worry about the question of whether or not universalism or culturalism ought to be the dominant answer is that these philosophers are well aware that many of the Western notions that came into their societies as a result of colonialism were often used very manipulatively in order to justify European dominance. So there's a certain amount of suspicion of the Western philosophical project, and yet philosophers practicing in these countries, of course, themselves have been educated in Western thought to a large extent. That's what philosophy became in those societies. One of the spokespeople for the culturalist viewpoint is Cheikh Anta Diop, a Senegalese intellectual, who argues that philosophy is always implicit in a culture's productions. If you look at the way economic behavior occurs in a particular society, if you look at the artworks of a society, there are all kinds of beliefs that are evident in that, and also decisions about how to solve certain philosophical issues. From his point of view, then, to talk about African philosophy really ought to take into account a whole range of different things that are happening in the society. Similarly, Augusto Salazar Bondy from Peru argues that there's a real problem that Western thought has become so dominant in Latin America. One of the results of this is that Latin American intellectuals and philosophers have really felt, in a sense, beholden to Western thought. The ideas of Western philosophy weren't generated in the context where they're actually being applied in Latin America. And the consequence is that there always seems to be a bit of a mismatch between what it is philosophers are doing and the real problems that people face. So he calls for an end to this, the development of what's truly an authentic philosophy of Latin America. We'll be talking more about Latin America in a future lecture, and for the remainder of this one, I'll primarily concentrate on the debate as it applies to African thought. This debate between universalists and culturalists has led to a lot of consideration of what we should do with what we know of traditional beliefs of various societies and now post-colonial nations. And the question here is, considering some of the things that we talked about in the last lecture, are these things really philosophical, or are these just a kind of summary of some beliefs people have which really haven't been very systematically considered or critically analyzed? Some people would say, well, yes, of course these are philosophical. And if we haven't systematically considered them, maybe one of the reasons is that they are part of an oral tradition, but that's no reason not to try to systematize them now. So some thinkers try the approach of finding out what they can from the oral tradition and trying to put it all together. Indeed, these thinkers who claim that there's nothing about an oral tradition that prevents it from being philosophy would say that if you don't acknowledge that the oral tradition can give us philosophical insight, then what you're doing in effect is claiming that the means and the message can't be separate. But indeed, there's no reason why people can't verbally convey philosophical insights, just as they do this oftentimes in writing. And indeed, some of these people who think systematizing traditional beliefs is a good plan, they maintain that it's really ethnocentric to insist that philosophy be something that is written down in texts on the format of Western philosophical treatises. After all, the whole problem has arisen because, or the problem of figuring out what authentic philosophy in Africa would be, has arisen because of colonialism, because models from the West, which really weren't very appropriate in the first place, have been imposed on Africa. So why should we say that the way the West practices philosophy is the only way to do it, and then somehow try to bend African thought to that kind of model? On the other side are opponents of what they call ethnophilosophy, these efforts to systematize traditional beliefs in a philosophical way. What I'll proceed to do is consider some of the criticisms that have been offered of these various strategies of putting together traditional beliefs and calling it philosophy. One of the spokespersons for the idea that ethnophilosophy really isn't philosophy in a full sense is Henry Odera Oruka, a Kenyan thinker. Oruka considered various ways in which contemporary Africa practices philosophy. And he thought that, in fact, there were 4 basic categories. One was the category of the ethnophilosophers, the people who attempted to write basic systematic accounts of how traditional beliefs work together and basically did nothing beyond that in his view. In other words, they tried to organize what it was that they could get from the oral tradition, ideally finding some consistency. This in itself is not really something that is not challenging. As we considered in the last lecture, there are often variant accounts of the same sort of thing. So if you ask, how is it that we end up getting the particular inner head we have in Yoruba thought? Well, there are various accounts. So the ethnophilosopher does have to somehow figure out how to synthesize these things. But Oruka claims that philosophy, to be fully philosophy, needs to be critical, needs to do more than just catalog, in effect, beliefs that are held, but needs to consider whether or not some of these beliefs are based on faulty assumptions or are inconsistent with other beliefs that are held. His view is that in Africa, there have always been, in fact, ethnophilosophers, or people who knew a lot about the beliefs of their societies, and he would not call them really ethnophilosophers, but calls them cultural sages, people who were aware of the wisdom that had been received from the past and were good at applying it. But his claim is those weren't the philosophers. The philosophers were those few people who probably were already cultural sages who went on to criticize or evaluate the beliefs that had been received from tradition. He sees a big difference between simply accepting what it is your tradition has given you and using those as your working tools to deal with reality, a worthwhile goal in itself. But he thinks that that itself is one project, whereas the project of evaluating these things, determining whether or not the tools that your inheritance has given you are really applicable in the here and now, and whether or not some of these ideas perhaps should end up being dismantled from your tradition. These, in fact, were what he calls the philosophical sages. So he distinguishes first ethnophilosophers and philosophical sages. Of course, he claims the philosophical sages are far rarer than cultural sages. Cultural sages are basically the wise people of the community, the people go to with problems. And his view is that all societies have these. But he thinks even though all societies probably have philosophical sages too, it's a much rarer individual who's able to reflect critically on the tradition. And without such people, in a sense, you're trapped in the views that have been handed down to you. So he thinks that philosophical sages serve a really vital role. In fact, they end up having to be very courageous people. He would view Socrates certainly as a philosophical sage, but look what happened to Socrates. It's sometimes a very dangerous thing to suggest that traditional beliefs aren't what people should continue to live by. Aruka considers two other categories, which I'll quickly mention, though we'll be encountering them in what precedes. One of them is the category of professional philosophers. These are current philosophy professors working in Africa who largely analyze their tradition using some of the tools that they've received from the West. Many, if not most of them, are educated in the West, or at least in Western techniques, and some of their projects tend to be using Western techniques, perhaps to analyze what's going on in African thought, but sometimes to evaluate exactly the same kind of issues that people anywhere else would be discussing. So it might not be culturally rooted at all. It might be even a question about European thought. It's quite possible for an African philosophy professor to write a paper about Descartes and not really bring in anything about the ideas that emerge in some African tribes about multiple souls or multiple soul elements. So that's another dimension of the philosophical scene operating currently. And certainly the professional philosophers are the ones who most consistently raise the question, does Africa have philosophy? A fourth group is a group that he calls nationalistic ideological. And these are the thinkers who are mostly concerned to address the concrete situation of African nations now. Their view is that whatever philosophy ought to be doing, it ought to be dealing with the realities of post-colonial life in these nations. And if wisdom from the past helps us to do that, well and good. But if not, let's not pay much attention to it. We have a really important agenda to address right now. We'll say a little bit more about that later on. Okay, so Aruka criticizes ethnophilosophy because it doesn't really deal with the critical aspect of philosophy that he thinks it needs to include. There are other critics of ethnophilosophy too who are more consistent in denigrating the whole, it's not that Aruka is not consistent, but Aruka does at least acknowledge that within the traditions that can be studied, we will find philosophical sages, but one has to find them. Just knowing things about traditional beliefs isn't enough, but one needs to find those people within the traditions who actually did criticize certain things and evaluate their traditional beliefs. But there are other views that are a little bit more antagonistic even to looking at the tradition, period. For example, some tend to think that ethnophilosophers are really inherently derogatory toward Africa. Now, it may seem a little ironic that someone would take the time and trouble to try to understand an African traditional system and still have denigrating goals. But nevertheless, many African thinkers think that that's exactly what happened. One of the problems is that the initial ethno-philosophical accounts were made by people outside the traditions they were studying. Probably the most important of these was a book called Bantu Philosophy, which was written by Placide Tempels, who is a Belgian missionary to the Congo. And Tempels, I think, to be fair to him, treated the worldview of the society that he dealt with more respect than many missionaries did. After all, he did take the time and trouble to try to figure out what the basic ideas of the Bantu peoples were. But some people would say, right off the bat, just the idea of writing a book called Bantu Philosophy is a bit of a problem. Why? Because the Bantu are a group of peoples who don't all agree about exactly all the details. What he assumed was that the people that he worked most directly with were representative of a much wider group of people. We'll find this complaint recurring in critics of ethnophilosophy. But more problematic still, what was Tempel's motive? Well, he was a missionary. Why did he want to understand the people that he worked with? Well, because he recognized that if you didn't, being very persuasive in promulgating Christian teaching wasn't very likely. So his goal, even though you might say initially was to understand, nevertheless it had this further purpose, which was to convince people to abandon their traditional views, or at least abandon them insofar as they didn't coincide with Christian belief. And that strikes people as not a very desirable goal at all. It's not really a very fair hearing if your only reason for listening to someone is to try to convert them into thinking something other than what they're saying. There's also a tendency in temples to view the truth as being basically the way Westerners and Christians tended to think of things. So although he analyzes the way the Bantu think in terms of abstract terms, he doesn't think the Bantu will do this themselves at all. And implicitly the idea is, well, we in the West are real philosophers. The Bantu just kind of do this implicitly, and when we go in with our ability to analyze, we can see what the basic lines of analysis are, but this is something that they would never reflect about at all. In general, these approaches that come from the outside often do have some motivation beyond simply trying to take an open mind to what people in the traditions in Africa are saying. And that strikes a lot of critics of ethnophilosophy as really pretty pernicious on the whole. It seems to be real concern with traditional thought in these societies, but in fact what it is trying to get a lot of information for an ulterior motive, namely to replace these traditions with one's own. Paul Nhauntunji, a contemporary African philosopher who is one of the professional group that Oruka talks about, thinks that in general to rely on an oral tradition is a problem. We can consider the problem that we have in figuring out, well, for the Yoruba, how do people get their inner heads? We don't know exactly just because there are variant accounts. Nhauntunji points out that in oral traditions, a lot of times we don't have enough that really gives us the wherewithal to say very specifically what's going on philosophically. In other words, we have some accounts. We can't really put them together, so we have to say they're variants. There isn't a system that brings these things all together. And his view is that for philosophers to discuss thought, to critically evaluate thought of a society, they need to have it in writing. Why? It gives them something clear to pinpoint. They can look at something, see what's being systematized, see what's being left out, and so on. If I were to say, well, I don't know if the Yoruba talk about this, that doesn't mean that they don't. It just means that the oral tradition as it's reached me hasn't included a certain kind of thing. Whereas if you have a philosophical system written out, you know what's included and what isn't included. Nhauntunji also is concerned with the fact that in any other society, when people talk about philosophy, they typically do refer to things that are written. He is rather contemptuous of the idea that, well, in Africa, of course, they didn't write it down, but everywhere else people wrote things down and it was very systematic and so on. He thinks that the result of that is to say that, well, there's philosophy and then there's African philosophy, which means not really philosophy at all. So his proposal is, let's just get rid of this notion that we can have philosophy without writing. He actually makes the rather bold proposal, seemingly an odd bold proposal, that we should call African philosophy philosophical writing by Africans. That might not sound very shocking, but in a way it is. I mean, consider Temples. Temples gives us this book called Bantu Philosophy, which was taken very seriously by a lot of people for a considerable period of time. Hauntunji would say, that isn't African philosophy. It isn't written by Africans. And he recognizes with Aruka that there are a number of approaches currently taken to philosophy in Africa. Why pick one and say, well, that's the real thing, whereas these other things are not? Instead, if they're written, if the effort is to be systematic, whether it's a philosophy professor trained in the West who lives in Africa, whether it's someone who actually immigrated to Africa, maybe came from somewhere else, but is now living in Africa, dealing with the cultural situation there, all of these can be called African philosophers. So there is such a thing as African philosophy, but he thinks we shouldn't be looking way to the past to find this out. This idea of past orientation is another point that some of the critics of ethnophilosophy have made. They point out that when people focus a lot of attention on the traditional beliefs of societies in Africa, they're really looking back to a really quite distant past. They point to the fact, for instance, that the major religions of Africa are Christianity and Islam, both Western religions. And what they're claiming, in effect, is that there isn't really a kind of purely traditional line of belief in any of these African societies that have since been colonized, because there's been interaction between whatever traditional beliefs were and Western viewpoints. And anyone living in Africa now inherits things from both. So again, the idea of looking to the traditions is really kind of going back to a golden age, perhaps, in some people's fantasies, but not anything that's very real, and certainly not anything that deals with Africa as we experience it now. Critics have also pointed out that to talk about African philosophy in terms of just what the traditional beliefs were is to exaggerate the unanimity of Africans, even within a single tribe. People don't all agree. I mean, if there's anything exploring the various traditions of the world should tell us, is that people have controversies wherever they are, whatever issues are important to them at the moment. And so we shouldn't think that giving a report, in effect, of what the Yoruba or any other tribe believed is really giving us the whole story. These might be the predominant views. As in earlier lectures, some of the things we highlighted are the predominant views in the West. But it would be really quite an exaggeration to say, well, this is what everybody thought. Of course it wasn't. The whole philosophical tradition involves people fighting about exactly these things. And so if we act as though, well, African philosophy, everybody absolutely agrees, but in every other tradition people are arguing about things, again, that's denigrating. The idea is, well, in Africa people weren't able to be critical, whereas everywhere else they were. The idea of this past orientation of ethnophilosophy has also been attacked by people who think that the practices that go with these traditional beliefs are in some cases outmoded. African feminists, for example, think that ethnophilosophy is certainly not the way to go, because oftentimes the beliefs about what is morally expected of someone has to do with notions about women that really should be passé, and that they're making active efforts to make passé. So again, ethnophilosophy doesn't deal with the situation as we're really encountering it in Africa. This leads to the conclusion of many of the people who fall into the nationalist ideological camp, as Aruka describes them. And these are the people that think that ethnophilosophy is really just irrelevant. What we ought to be concerned with in Africa, they claim, is liberating people from the legacy of colonialism. Frantz Fanon, a philosopher from Martinique, originally is one of the well-known spokespeople for this position. His view is that what we should do is, if there are resources that we can take over, fine, but the real situation that most people in societies that have been colonized are facing is the fact that their own humanity has been negated for so long and so structurally that what's important now is just to destroy that structure. Fanon is viewed as a major advocate of violence. And I should point out that his notion of violence includes more things than we probably usually would include under that category. For example, his view is there's been so much violence done just by telling the African where his place in the scheme of things was, that any effort to sort of cross those lines is already an act of violence. But he does have a very extreme view about the importance of taking violent action just in order to overcome this terrible legacy. Fanon was a psychiatrist, and one of the motivations for some of his claims is that he recognized, in effect, what kind of mental illness was wrought on so many people as a result of being treated as less than human in their own countries. Well, there are quite a few arguments, obviously, against ethnophilosophy, and some people view it to be a possibility to take some of the things that have come to us from African traditions and work with them, but work with them in new ways, or drawing attention to certain themes in them, but adapting those to our current situation. The notion of celebrating what's uniquely African was promoted by a movement called the Negritude movement, which began in France in the 1930s. And the people who began this movement were Africans who were being educated in France. So already we've got one of those situations that professional philosophers often point to, and that Aruka points to as well, the fact that we do have a lot of people with mixed heritages. They're trained in Western techniques, but they come from African nations and are trying to put these together. One of the main spokespeople for the Negritude movement was Leopold Sédar Senghor, who was the long-term president of Senegal, as well as a man of letters. And his notion of negritude, and what this whole movement believed, was that there's a certain kind of approach to the world that Africans take that is inherently different from the approach to the world that Europeans take. He comments, for example, in dark Africa, people always dance because they feel, and they always dance someone or something. Now, to dance is to discover and to recreate, to identify oneself with the forces of life, to lead a fuller life, and in short, to be. It is, at any rate, the highest form of knowledge. The reason of classical Europe is analytic through utilization. The reason of the African Negro, intuitive through participation. Now, what he's comparing there are the basic approaches to the world that he thinks the Europeans take and that Africans take. His claim is that Europeans tend to be very analytical, that what they believe we should do to know things is try to remove ourselves from our emotional reactions. We might here think of Kant. When Kant talks about morality and proposes the categorical imperative, what he's explicitly doing is trying to give us a tool to help us disengage from a situation where we want something. If we apply the categorical imperative and think, gee, is this a kind of approach that I think anyone at all could take? What we've done is moved ourselves out of a situation where we have some concrete desire and moved into a more analytic mode. And this, Senghor claims, is typical in all dimensions of knowledge in European discussion. Africans, on the other hand, assume that an emotional approach to things is the proper way to deal with them. And Senghor emphasizes the participatory feature of what he sees as the African approach. So to come to know things is not to kind of get as much distance as you can and look at it from that point of view, but instead to really participate very vitally with things. In Western thought, sometimes a distinction is made between knowing that and knowing how, where knowing that tends to be a kind of more detached view where you have information as a result of looking at things without necessarily taking a personal invested interest of an emotional sort. Whereas the African approach, according to Senghor, is much more like knowing that, namely that you've become, knowing how. You've become accustomed to things, you've learned about things by engaging with them. Senghor's view is that both traditions have something incomparably important to provide humanity with, and therefore it's important for the two approaches to interact in dialogue. But some people find his approach deficient, in particular those who think that this idea of negritude, which is supposed to be a racial trait, and even extend to people who are simply descendants of Africans, no matter how long their family has been away from Africa, that this is really reinforcing racism, reinforcing stereotypes, reinforcing the notion that Europe is the rational place where real philosophy is done, and that Africa is a place where people just react emotionally. There's also the assumption that there's a homogeneity, not only among Africans, but among African descendants as well. And so many people have rejected Senghor's notion. Nevertheless, his idea that it's important to focus on what is concrete to the African experience, even if people disagree with his analysis of it, does characterize the thinking of a lot of philosophers in post-colonial nations today.